I'm very pleased to welcome you today to Zajezdnia History Center. It's a place where solidarity movement in Wrocław was born, and where we tell the post-war history of Wrocław. Today we have special guest. It is Professor Alessandro Portelli. It's one of the most prominent researchers in oral history, and our institution has published translation of his works, and this is unique opportunity to discuss about oral history. And the conversation will be moderated by Professor Marta Kurkowska-Budzan, who is a founding mother of professional research in oral history in Poland. So we have two famous oral historians, and I wish very nice, inspiring discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we start? We are very happy, Sandro, to have you here.
So am I.
Yes, you are such a wonderful guest all the time, every time. 2 weeks ago we visited Krakow, and you are again in Poland. We are so grateful, and we are so grateful for letting us to publish this anthology of your texts. And this is our occasion, as Wojciech Kucharski just mentioned. We meet here in this particular building, a heritage site of Wrocław. And actually, you just noticed that there's a Solidarity trade union meeting just right now. There are lots of issues, lots of threads that are coming up when we mention this building, when we mention solidarity, workers' culture, and your name in this. You just visited the exhibition, and maybe we should start from this topic. What are your impressions?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for inventing this book, which is probably the fullest selection of my work anywhere. So I'm sorry I can't read it, but I hear that the translator was excellent. So I'm really excited to be here. And this was a fantastic visit because, well, it really showed me the one way in which you can represent the history and the meaning of a place. I especially appreciated the fact that the history of the opposition to the communist regime was underground, which is, I think, very symbolic. But also, you know, what resonates with the oral history approach, the attention to everyday life, to the small details, to the objects of everyday life, which you don't often find in museums, because of course our tradition of museum is, you know, great artworks, and oral history is about daily life. So I think this was like, and of course being here. Seeing the Solidarność flags, you know. I remember being in West Virginia in 1989, and there was a huge miners' strike over there, and the strikers had been evicted from their homes that belonged to the company, and they had created a tent city, and they called it Solidarity Camp in recognition of. They also pointed out that the Polish solidarity was getting a lot more attention than American solidarity in the media, but that's, you know, that's cultural class struggle for you. So, and in fact, I made a point of retrieving an old article I had written on the impact of the solidarity movement on Italian workers who were mostly communists at the time. So the irony of finding themselves with class struggle fought against the communist state was a shock, was a trauma, and this is one of the ways in which Solidarność has changed politics and culture also outside Poland. So I'm very excited to be here.
Okay, so let's talk about you, Sandro. You mentioned that Italian workers were at large communists. And this is the topic that, of course, in Poland, it's such a topic that might be controversial. I mean, even the term communism or communist is perceived with such a difficult baggage, or history baggage. I'd like to ask you, what does it mean to be a communist in Italy? And perhaps history matters in this topic. What does it mean to be a communist nowadays in contemporary Italy?
Well, there are hardly any left. Well, it goes back to two elements of our history. One being the fact that, as opposed to what was going on here, the church, the established church in Italian history was always basically on the side of the ruling classes, so that the workers' movement, the movement of working people developed very often in opposition or without the support of the church, and that was one thing. The other thing, of course, is that we went through fascism, and fascism began in Italy right after the October Revolution, so that and the only really active opposition on the ground in Italy was the communist opposition, which means that a number of working people, but also a number of intellectuals, of artists, were drawn to the Communist Party in the name of freedom, not in the name of what was happening on the other side, which they either didn't know or was kept somehow from the information of the rank and file. But remember that Antonio Gramsci had serious problems. The founder of the Italian Communist Party had very serious problems with what was going on in Russia, in the Soviet Union. So that, ironically, maybe not, the democratic opposition, the opposition for people's rights, for the battle for freedom, was waged by the same forces that here were identified with opposition, with oppression. And this is incidentally, there's a great new film by Nanni Moretti. Nanni Moretti happens to be a personal friend even before he owned a camera. But Nanni Moretti is probably the most creative filmmaker in Italy. And the film is called Il Sol dell'Avvenire, the sun of the future, which was a symbol of socialism. And it's about this Uchronia. A Uchronia is when you imagine that a turn in history might have gone differently. And the Uchronia is that 1956, what would have happened if the Italian Communist Party had sided on the side of the Hungarian rebels? What the history would have been like. And that was the main error that they made, and it had this impact. So there's a complicated irony, and incidentally, because of what was happening here in the Soviet Union, I never was a member of the Communist Party, I remember my friend, who's a writer, filmmaker, theater actor from Łódź, is this how you pronounce this? Mm-hmm. And he was always intrigued by the fact that wherever he went, all the people that supported him, that were on his side and everything, they were waving red flags. And he could figure it out, but it was very, very ironic to him that the same symbol that stood on his side for freedom, for equality, was the symbol of opposition here. Also, there's one thing that I think is important in that we talk about freedom, but at least we have been raised to identify freedom with equality. And so that the battle, because you cannot be free unless, if you have somebody that has power over you. So that this is a theme that has somehow been erased from the political scene today, but in our tradition, in the tradition of the Italian anarchist, socialist, democratic, left liberal, communist left, the two concepts of freedom and equality always went together. And I think we have been losing this connection recently.
Mm-hmm. In the introduction to the Polish anthology of your text, which I have had the pleasure to write, I quoted your words from, I think, 2005, from your blog. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that
I used to have a blog.
You used to have a blog, and it's still online?
It's still online.
I found it, and you introduce yourself there. You write about your passions, and at that time you listed in this order, equality and freedom. This is what you just talked about. Memory and listening to people's stories, teaching, folk music, books, movies, football and rock and roll. And I'd like to talk about all of these passions. Maybe just browse them, but you just talk about equality and freedom, but would you please tell us more what is, because you are also a specialist in American culture, you are an observer of American culture, you write a lot about that, you are a columnist in Italy as well. So what is equality about in 2023 in Italy or in United States? What does it mean? Equality and freedom, perhaps both.
Well, the most immediate thing that comes to mind is, of course, race and immigration. Equality in the United States has been first, it's in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, and which is rephrased in the UN Declaration, all human beings are born equal. And the irony is that these words, all men are created equal, were written by one of the great men in American history, Thomas Jefferson, who was also the #2 slave owner in the in the colonies. The #1 slave owner was George Washington. So this great battle for this foundation of democracy and freedom was led by the two greatest slave owners, which is not hypocrisy. It's again, irony, just as in the case of the many meanings of communism. But one of the things that happened was that immediately after these words were made public, those few black people who could write started writing letters to Thomas Jefferson saying, okay, we just heard that all human beings are equal. When do we start? And so the question, the relationship between equality and freedom in the history of the United States has been primarily on the question of race. And of course there's something which is never mentioned, but it's basic, even more basic, which is gender, women's rights. And the first, the main speaker at the first Women's Rights Conference in the United States, 1849, was Frederick Douglass, who was an escaped slave. So the connection was very, very powerful, very strong, until it was broken after the war. So, on the other hand, the American narrative was that because there was no inherited rank, you didn't have an hereditary aristocracy. In America, there were no classes, which means that the question of equality for working people has always been downplayed, and also thanks to the myth of social mobility. The myth was you can be born poor, but then you can become president, and it never was true, but it was always a possibility somehow. And ultimately, you touched something that I could go on, but there's a book by Stendhal, the great French writer. The book is called Lucien Leuven, and it was written in the 1930s, and there are 4 or 5 references to America in that French book of the 1830s. They sound exactly like the references to Russia after 1917. I would never go live in America where even my bootmaker can call me an equal. So the United States was caught in this contradiction, being, on the one hand, the country of revolution throughout 19th century, and on the other hand, the last Western nation to have slavery. So that makes for a very fascinating history, and it goes on because, of course, those two movements that are linked together, Black Lives Matter and Me Too, still tell us that no, gender and race are still structuring the social hierarchies. In the case of Italy, race is different because it's new. So, on the one hand, we believe that there was no racism in Italy. Of course, we forgot that we had racist laws outlawing Jewish people in 1938, but we don't mention this. And then, as we began to have a migrant population, we discovered that, of course, we were racist. And as opposed to the United States, we hadn't had an anti-racist movement. We didn't have a Martin Luther King, so that racism in Italy it's probably less structural. The country is not built on this, but it's much more open and rabid. One anecdote that I was telling today. I've been doing interviews in in Terni, my hometown, an industrial town, in which there is a big immigration, both from Africa and from Eastern Europe. There's a significant Polish community there. And I interviewed a young lady, born in Poland, grown up in Terni, and she told me a story that shows that when you don't have an other race, you invent her. So she told me that when she was in 10th grade, her teacher told her to wear some darker makeup because she was too white. See? So, you know, there is a need to invent a racial other. If you don't have anybody if you still don't have black people, then you have people who are too white. And incidentally, there's a novel, and then I'll shut up after this. There's a novel by an African-American writer, George Schuyler, 1931, called Black No More, in which is it's a fantasy. A scientist invents a technique to turn black people white, so that the whole society collapses, because until they discover that the former black people have become whiter than the original white people, so that society can start discriminating again. So, I mean, it's really, racism is not a remnant of the past. Racism is something that we keep reinventing every time. We had a time when the word Albanese, Albanian, was an insult. We have forgotten this because now we have other targets. So I think the other question is whether we think of equality as equal starting point and then competition, as the American model, or we think of equality as everybody the same, as in some aspects of the communist system, or we think of equality as equal rights and an open society. This is what I think the Italian left was striving for, and I think we failed. We failed miserably.
Mm-hmm. You write and talk a lot about your experience as a representative of middle class, interviewing working class people. And sometimes I feel that, especially when we were working on this anthology, that this is something that it's not so common in our culture. I mean, the culture or the society of Poland, of post-war Poland, was maybe audience has a different view, but we were equal in terms of we didn't have this classic class structure until, of course, the capitalism and free markets was introduced, and it started to work on that. So this is something that we, when reading your text, are always, at least to me, somehow difficult to understand. However, nowadays we of course can put ourselves in your shoes and imagine how it is. When we talk about workers and working culture and equality and freedom and racism, for example, because we tend to see workers and working culture on this good side, on this bright side of the world, and racism and all this stuff connected to ruling classes on this dark side. But isn't it like workers are racists? Workers tend to be violent against, and this is the story of Terni, perhaps again, but I like it. I don't like the history of Terni when you speak about what has been changing there, but Would you please comment on that and tell perhaps the audience about what's happening in Turkey and what about working culture? Well, it's another question also, because we see that in Poland, in public discourse, we see the tendency of disappearing even the word worker, robotnik. We don't use it anymore. We use employee, for example, specialist, or all this stuff. So what about working culture in Italy, for example? What's going on with that? Does it exist anymore, or is it changing?
Well, I think we should make a distinction between working class and workers, in the sense that workers still exist. Working class is much more complicated, because it means that working people see themselves as a collective subject with shared visions, rights, and interests, and a shared identity. The real change, I think, had been coming very slowly since the 70s, and then growing basically until the last generation. I interviewed for my first book on Terni, which was a generation that was around 70s and 80s. They still, most of them, identify the fact of being workers as the core of their identity. Which, of course, it wasn't a political mistake by the leadership. Was that, yes, they were workers first, most of all, yes, but they were also male, for one thing. The working class had a gender, and more recently, they're also white. Incidentally, in Italy, we have achieved a fantastic political success because immigrants and children of immigrants born in Italy have no political rights, and that is a sizable portion of the working class. We have managed to have a sizable portion of the working class that has no political rights, and to disenfranchise. And they don't even perceive it this way because it's not perceived in terms of class. So gradually what happened was that, partly with the collapse of communism, which was based on this working class identity, the right wing and other organizations began to offer other identities. So that in the first place, in the 90s, the Northern League, which was more or less a secessionist organization, began to define people in terms of their regional origin, Northerners versus Southerners, and Northern workers versus Southern migrants that were stealing their jobs. And then, of course, the Africans came and it was going to work. So you define them in those terms. And of course, gender came up, and racism. It's not as if the individual workers were not ever male chauvinists, racists, nationalists, but these things were declared politically not correct by the communist leadership. You couldn't say them. You might, and therefore there was no space for this kind of discourse to grow. When the Communist Party dissolved, suddenly racism, sexism, regionalism became politically correct. And people are no longer ashamed to define themselves racist. the regional government of Lazio, my region, has just withdrawn its support from the gay pride events in Rome, because of course we have never been able to pass a law against homophobia, for instance. Now, homophobia was rampant in the working class, in the male working class, of course, but it was somehow suppressed, unrecognized. It was considered a contradiction. Now it's rampant, now it's free, now it's open. So what happened was that the idea of class identity as foremost, as basic, somehow kept other impulses in check. When the working class identity has been wiped out and the post-communist left has been involved in this, in the denial of that there was such a thing of class. You know, Zygmunt Bauman, the liquid society, which I think has been misread a lot in the West. You know? But somehow they use this to say that there are no collective identity, there are no shared identity. So after this, it's as if you had erected some kind of dike against the floods of racism, sexism, of homophobia, and then you take that off, and it's rampant and it's free. And incidentally, anti-fascism is no longer part of common sense in my country. So that, well, as I was mentioning earlier, our current Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, identifies with Orban and with Poland as her models of the kind of democracy she would like to create. So this is, and I think the denial and the fact that that most workers no longer see their common interest as workers as primary, and but rather they identify as, Lombards, as male, as whites, means that of course they can vote for anyone, and there's a sizable. It's an interesting apparent contradiction, but a lot of workers who vote for the right are members of the left trade unions, because of course the left trade unions are more militant and active in defense of their immediate interests, but they no longer see their interest as workers as part of a political vision, as part of the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's talk then about memory. Mm-hmm. What is memory?
Well, everybody has a different. I think memory is, well, number one, it's two things, basically. One is the presence of the past in the present. There is the ways in which the past is an active force today. And I have a couple of metaphors in mind from different levels of American culture. One is Bruce Springsteen, the ghost of Tom Joad, when in the 1990s he evokes the memory of the 30s as something that helps perceive what's going on in the 90s. And Toni Morrison, Beloved, which is a novel in which a slave child who has been murdered reincarnates. And again, in the case of Toni Morrison, that is a metaphor for the fact that the ghost of slavery has never disappeared. It's still there. And so on the one hand, and the ghost is a good metaphor, because the ghost is something which is apparently it's dead, but it's not. And there's a famous phrase by William Faulkner where he says, "The past was not dead; it wasn't even past." You know? And that's one way of thinking about it. The other way in which I think of memory is more as a verb, remembering, than as and as a noun, memory. That is, memory as the work of trying to interpret the meaning of past events from the point of view of the present. So one thing that we have come to realize in the field of oral history is that when you do an interview, say about the strike of 1982, and if you do an interview about it today, it's about 1982, but it's of 2023. That is, it's about the relationship. It's about what 1982 means in 2023. So it's a work of constantly remaking sense, because of course, while the past is more or less there, the present keeps changing. So every 10 years or so, somebody does a set of interviews on the memory of 1968, which is our crucial year, and the meaning of the story changes every 10 years because you're looking at the past from a different point of view. So these two things, the presence of the past today and how do we interpret that presence. When I talk about the presence of the past today, I was talking about how anti-fascism is no longer common sense, and that is the result of a struggle over memory fought by the right, by revisionist historians, mass media, over the meaning of 1943-44, which is the founding of Italian democracy, which in part had to do with the fact that the founding of Italian democracy, the Italian Constitution was the first signer of the Italian Constitution, Umberto Terracini, was a communist Jew. So what do you make of a constitution signed by a communist Jew in 2023? So the attack on the battle over 1943, 44, 45 has an impact over how people will vote in 2023. And that's what memory is. That's what the presence of memory. And the third thing, maybe, memory is a crucial site of struggle. I was going to say class struggle, but struggle in general, including class struggle.
Mm-hmm. So let's move to listening to people's stories, another passion of yours. You just said that the memory changes, let's say, every 10 years.
Well, every day.
Yes, every day. So in this case, if we assume that, is oral history research, can the study of any given topic can ever be completed? Do you have any such topics that you could consider, well, I'm done, it's closed, I completed this research?
No, I don't think so. And this is why it's so much fun, because it never is. Like, the reason I'm back doing another book on the town of Terni, I have done 3 other books about it, is that if somebody reads my 3rd book was published in 2015. If one reads that book, it's about a town that no longer exists. It's completely changed. So while in a way, while it stands as a document of what it looked like back then, it has nothing to do with what it looks like now. When, incidentally, there was a local election in which they expected the extreme post-fascist, post-fascist right candidate to win. He was beaten by somebody who was even more to the right, and 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I wrote about a red working class town. Suddenly it's gone. So you had to bring it up to date, which means that not only oral history is never over, but history is never over. Because if you include oral history in the work of history, then it challenges the idea that I've looked at all possible sources. You can't do this when you include oral sources, because I often question, like, for instance, I was almost finishing. I have done 120 interviews in 5 months internally, with this idea that the right wing was safely in power in town. Then suddenly, this election and this unexpected result, I had to rewrite the whole book because the present has changed. So usually, what I try to do, I tend to stop when, after a while, I keep doing interviews and nobody tells me anything I haven't heard yet already. So I said, this is a good moment to stop, But then of course history goes on. I spent 30 years doing oral history in Kentucky, and then Kentucky in 2023 is no longer the same as it was in 2010, except I don't have the means and the energy and the money to go back. But see, so it never ends, because it's a relationship between something that more or less stays the same, which is the past, and something that keeps changing, which is the present. And even, you interview somebody and you have an interview, and then you go back and the same person has a different story. But, the main narrative, which is, the basic essay in the book, the story of the 1953 strike in Terni. In 2004, there was another strike in which they did exactly the same things. What had changed? Language and the vision of the future. In 1953, see, this goes back to, they fired 3,000 workers from the steel works, and they fought back and they lost. But the great working class poet and folk singer Dante Bartolini wrote a song that says, "Let's stand our ground, because the great victory is not far." I mean, they were kicking them, losing their jobs en masse. They were being fired, and they still looked at the great victory, which was the sun of the future. 2004, there's no such thing as a great victory. So that means, and what is happening is something, they all have mortgages on their homes. The workers in 1953 had built their own homes with their own hands. They owned them because they made them. In 2004, a couple of generations later, they were a little bit more well off, and they bought their homes on credit with a bank. So you lose your job, and you lose your home. So they felt, on the one hand, there was no great victory, for all of us together. On the other hand, each of them had something to lose personally. So that goes back to what we were talking about. So, and in 2014, they did it again. They did the longest strike in the history of the labor movement. And what happened at the end was, the company wanted to fire 500 people. They fought back. No job losses and everything. In the end, the company just offered 60,000 euros to those who would leave their jobs voluntarily. 600 left, which tells you that on the one hand, there was no collective class solution to the crisis. Everybody just saved themselves individually. And on the other hand, that they no longer believed in the industrial future of their city and their class. So, and it never ends, because of course, now a lot of these people, 10 years later, are desperately trying to get their factory jobs again, because the money they got is spent and they're unemployed. So it goes on and on. And the same actions mean something entirely different in different times. Because one thing which we hardly ever consider when we do history, we think of the past, but people act in the past and the present with a vision of the future. So what kind of future do they have in mind today, as opposed to what they had in mind in 53? So it never ends, and it really never ends, because what changes is the future. So.
You just brought up the Dante Bartolini name,
yes,
which appears to be like a protagonist of many of your texts, and we have Dante in this anthology in a couple of articles. Let's talk about folk music then. But folk music, Italian and American. Where did your interest in folk music come from? Because I never learned that from your text. We just know that you went to some taverna in Terni trying to record people songs, but where did it come from?
Well, there are two. Number one, the last word in my blog was rock and roll.
Yes.
Yes. So I think of myself as a child of the 50s, and which means, of course, that if you grew up in the 50s, what gave you a sense of a generational identity was rock and roll, was music, was American music. So you had this connection with America through music and through a generational identity, which in fact, the movements in the United States, student movements, were very much civil rights on the one hand, student movements on the other, and black students in the center. So, and because I'm not very, very musically inclined, I used to like, Elvis Presley 45s always had two sides, a blues side and a country side. And I used to like the country sides better, which were the B-sides. And gradually I discovered, that there was, such a thing as American folk songs. And I went to America on a high school scholarship, and I bought all the folk music albums. And at that point I realized, if you're in Los Angeles at the age of 18 in 1960, you're at the right place at the right moment at the right age. And this was a great discovery that there was a connection between the folk music movement and civil rights and the peace movements, that went back to the 30s, to the 1930s, to Woody Guthrie. I ended up writing my thesis on Woody Guthrie. So, and of course, you know, I was given my first Bob Dylan album by my classmates in 1962, and I just ended up writing a book on Bob Dylan a couple of years ago. So, so you have this, you discover this connection between music and movements. And then I came home and I asked myself, isn't there such a thing as Italian folk music as well? And 1964 was the year in which the Italian folk music revival made the news, because there was a big concert of Italian folk singers at the Spoleto Festival of Two Worlds, and they were all arrested for singing anti-war songs. So I discovered that this existed. And to make a long story short, you know, you start out buying Bob Dylan albums, then you discover that there's something back of Bob Dylan, which is Woody Guthrie, and you buy Bob Dylan, Woody Guthrie albums. Then you discover that behind Woody Guthrie, there's such a thing as a Library of Congress recordings of field work. And then after that, what do? You go to the field and try to collect it yourself. Now, I couldn't do that in America, but I could do it in Italy. And that was a great discovery, again, that takes us back to our main theme. That Italian folk music was steeped in Italian working class history and movement. That is, that whereas that Bandiera Rossa, the red flag, is a genuine folk song, not written by anyone, like the International, but created in the oral tradition. And I collected any number of socialist, anarchist, communist folk songs in the resistance, you know. So the connection, the connection between music and movements was there both in the States and in Italy, but the movements were different. And Italian folk music was a lot more political than, let's say, a lot more ideological than American folk song. So the theory behind this came from Gianni Bosio. Gianni Bosio was a socialist libertarian historian who had been kicked out of, he had founded a history journal, and he was kicked out by the communists, incidentally, because he didn't stick to the party line. And Gianni Bosio, because the main, you see, according to the official communist intellectuals back then, which is one of the reasons I never liked that part. I liked those people, the people in the party, not the party. The history of the working class was the history of their political organization. And the history of their political organization was the history of their leadership. So if you write the history of the leading class of the communist movement, Gianni Bosio said, no, the history of the working class is the history of the working class. So how do we tell the history of the working class? We need to use the sources that the working classes, plural, created for themselves. And what are these sources? Folk music and oral history. So the movement, the Italian folk music revival and the reinvention of oral history in Italy went together. And and Gianni Bosio gave me my first tape recorder, and he gave me my only teaching. No, I'm totally, self-taught on this. And he said, never turn it off. Never turn it off. Which I think is, number one, it means you never can tell when people will have something interesting to say, or you never can tell when people will start singing. I have a number of friends who have great recordings, and the first syllable is always missing because people start singing. And also because it's bad manners. You turn it off, you're telling the person, I'm not interested. Which is why I'd never heard about oral history, but I was collecting those folk songs, and because I was collecting working class folk songs, anti-fascist folk songs, people will also tell me the story of the song. And when I realized that the stories were wrong, instead of reacting as a professional historian would have, you can't rely on oral sources. I reacted as a professional literary theorist, which I was. What does it mean? What does it mean? And and all my oral history work came from there. So basically, the connection is, folk song as one of the ways in which working people express their presence in history in all possible ways. Thus, the first or second record, Gianni Bosio created a record label. The first or second record that they published was a record of traditional religious songs. Not because they were religious, but because folk religion was part of working class identity and history. So, and in fact, some of my best experiences, both in the States and in Italy, had taken places at churches, sanctuaries, shrines, and things like that.
Now we know how you ended up in the field. Tell us more about Circolo. Well, we also came to Song and Sound archives of Circolo Gianni Bosio. Would you please tell us more about that? Because the Circolo itself, as we have such all kind of clubs in Poland, institutions like cultural institutions, but Circolo is something different, I think. How does it function in the public, in the space, in the city? And tell us more about the archives, because what we can actually check online, they're quite big.
Well, I don't know, the name Circolo means a circle, which I guess it has more of an egalitarian impact. It just came. We don't use club, but so basically, and the idea was that because Gianni Bosio had created this organization in Milan. Now they're in Florence, and they had they created the first big sound archive in Europe, and so we thought that this was going on in the north, and I thought we could do the same in Rome. I had met a number of young musicians. Well, basically the point was, because I am totally not musically gifted, the only thing I could do with the songs that I collected was archive them, but also make them available to real musicians. And so what I put together a group of young musicians that performed these songs for my tapes. I passed the tapes on to Giovanna Marini, who is possibly Italy's greatest musician. The daughter of one of the working class people I had interviewed in Terni, turned out to is now Italy's #2 folk singer, things like that. And also other young people were interested in doing field work. So we put together a group of people that we opened a space where we could do small concerts and the interesting thing was that because we didn't have any money, the place that we opened was sort of a cellar underground, and it was so damp that you couldn't put tapes in it. So the tapes stayed in my stayed in my house until 1999, where we finally were able to open the archive, and it's there. Two things. One is Circolo Gianni Bosio is clearly identified as an independent left organization, meaning basically that we're not interested in which party, which organization you're a member of or not. But at a time of a lot of factionalism in the Italian left, each little splinter group was fighting against the others. The Gianni Bosio's group in Milan and ours in Rome were practically the only places where anybody from the most reformist to the most extreme left could work together culturally. But we didn't have any, so we have been based essentially on volunteer work. Now, thanks to a set of circumstances, the archive has a space in the House of History and Memory in Rome that belongs to the city, and we've been given a space for the archive. We have lost a space where we used to do concerts, a folk music school and everything. We lost that because it was an occupied space, and in the name of the law, we were kicked out, and the space is now crumbling and abandoned. But we're homeless. We have no public funding, so we rely entirely on volunteer work, which is much more difficult today than it used to be, because young people are no longer in control of their time. Back in the 70s, 80s, you more or less knew when you had work, when you had school, and when you had time for activism. Today they don't know if they're working tomorrow, and this means that you can't rely on this. So it's very complicated. It's very difficult. But I had a great joy just the other day, because 3 months ago, a lady emailed me from Cincinnati, Ohio, and she says, I've read in your book that you interviewed my grandmother. Could you tell me about her? So I said, we actually have the tape. And she said, can I have it? And I said, well, as soon as we get around to digitizing it, which it took us 3 months, but we did it, we sent it to her, and she's been sending, rapturous messages of thanks, because, it's so precious there for her. So that's part of what the archive is for. The history of the Circolo Gianni Bosio has always been a history of, I'm sorry to be quoting Fidel Castro, turning defeat into victory. Which means, we had a mimeographed magazine. When it turned out that we didn't have the energy to produce a mimeographed magazine, we said, okay, let's do a printed journal. And we did a printed journal. Now that we no longer have a space for small events, we decided, let's do a major festival. and we're doing a folk festival in the Abruzzi. You're all invited, incidentally. It's in a beautiful space in the National Park of the Abruzzi, small town, very good food, beautiful landscape. So, it's as if you're always on the verge of downfall, and somehow you manage to go forward. But what really counts is that we have created a name. That is, it has become a respected organization, and it's taken us 50 years, but we're there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we have teaching on the list, and I'm pretty sure that we didn't have chance to talk about that, and I'm going to touch the academic teaching. You were, for many years, you were a lecturer in Anglo-American literature at University of Siena and La Sapienza University in Rome. My question is, have you learned anything from your students?
Well, let's put it this way. I remember three epiphanies. One is, because my own mentor was a major scholar in American and English literature, and so when he retired and I took his place, I thought I was supposed to continue doing what he was doing. Until the day it occurred to me, look, I had Agostino Lombardo. These poor children have me, and might as well give them what I can do. And so, well, there was just somebody just posted something on Facebook about how great it was to have me. So back in the 70s, but and number one. So I started teaching I did teach Moby Dick, I did teach the classics, but I also started teaching folk song, Woody Guthrie. The first dissertation on Bruce Springsteen in Italy in the I was the advisor for that, So breaking the boundaries between history, literature, language, music, popular culture, high culture, somehow later this is called cultural studies now in the United States, and it's very academic. To me, it was this is what I can do. The other epiphany was one day I looked at my class and I said, these kids have been born 15 years after the Beatles dissolved, after the end of the Beatles. To me, the Beatles were still new because I'm from the 50s. See, to them, the Beatles were past history. So how do you relate to them? And that was very complicated, because one thing that kept arising was, what do they have in common among themselves? Very little, very little. So just finding political references that they could all understand was a lot more complicated. So I used to be all Italian children had to read a book by Alessandro Manzoni, I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed, the great classical novel from the 1800s. And that was wonderful because it was a perfect, conventional, realistic novel that you could use as, as an example of a conventional, traditional novel to distinguish from the postmodern and everything. Now they don't read that anymore. So it's very, so that was complicated. What I learned from my students, two things. One day I discovered that 2/3 of the people I had in my seminar were musicians, singers, and actors. So I said, why don't we put on a play? And because the seminar, I was teaching a seminar on Appalachian oral history, so with their talents, we put together a performance based on Appalachian folk songs, my interviews and everything, which we took around. We traveled around Italy a number of times. So, and of course, because one thing that I soon realized is I know things that they don't know. They know things that I don't know. And it's a sort of an exchange. And the other thing was, I used to hate it when they kept taking notes, trying to follow every word you said, because the act of taking notes, ironically, distracts you from listening. So, and there was only one young woman in class of Italian Indian background. She's now teaching literature, postmodern, post-colonial literature in the University of Newcastle, England. So she was just a student then. And I noticed that she wasn't taking notes. She was sitting like this. And every once in a while, she would write something. And I thought, I must have said something. She was, my test of whether what I was saying had some meaning to them, because she was not uncritically jotting down everything. She was, and the other thing that I learned later was how powerful is the impact of your teaching. Because after I wrote this book on Nazi occupation in Italy and everything, I started being invited to schools to talk about this. And I was invited to talk about anti-fascism and resistance. And every school I went to, the English teachers, the teachers of English, were my former students. And suddenly you realize that what I taught to them, they were each in their own way carrying on. So that teaching is really, a link in a long tradition in which I was, even though I was different from my mentor, still I was a product of his teaching, including the independence that he stimulated. But then it goes on, and it's a fascinating chain of cultural transmission.
A small question, perhaps very personal. Is teachers' profession appreciated in Italy nowadays? And general teachers, not academic teachers. How is it?
I don't think so. Well, my mother was a high school teacher. And back when I was growing up, that was a huge status symbol. In Italy, they call anybody who teaches from the 6th grade on is a professor. So it was something. And you saw that sort of being eroded slowly but radically over time. And today, well, Italian teachers are underpaid, and they're, of course, they're all accused of being anarchist radicals from '68 because they no longer think of school as a place where you sift out the ruling classes and leave the others behind, and that's also, well, there's a trend in society where your enemy is the person that is closest to you. So we have a number of cases of doctors being attacked by patients in hospitals, and teachers being blamed for the failure. You fail a child, the family will sue you and bring you to court. And so the sense that authority, which nobody likes, but the sense that somehow you know what you're doing has disappeared. And so but all of these professions are under attack. Doctors, nurses, teachers. In the United States, incidentally, the rise of the Trump movement had to do with the fact that the Democratic Party was the party of teachers, lawyers, doctors, and who are because the everyday person never comes in touch with the millionaires, with the billionaires, their obstacles are the teachers, the doctors, and so they hate those, and this is happening. So, on the one hand, what used to be the middle class is slowly sinking down to working class, without recognizing the fact, and so without gaining any consciousness of this. On the other hand, the working class that sees itself endangered identifies them as, the root of some of their evils. So, in the case of the university, typically, there was the only communist soccer player in the Italian major league once wrote an autobiography, and he said, "I didn't make the major league. The major league sunk down to my level." And when I became a university professor, I felt the same. I didn't make the university. The university sank down to my level. At this point, the university is under attack, and especially from on the one hand, the creation of what they call centers of excellence, which where you sift the talent and the resources, and on the other hand, from all kinds of private universities. Universities that work through media and everything. And these private universities make a lot of money, and they, because they grant degrees to people that could never make it at the public university. Because we still have a situation. Italy is the opposite of Britain. In Italy, it's a public school. It's state schools which are good, and the private school, including, unfortunately, the large majority of the church-controlled schools, are remedial schools. So, and this is, but once you erode the prestige and the quality and of the public school system, what you're actually doing is undermining one of the bulwarks of the Italian democratic constitution, which is the public school system. And privatizing schools, privatizing the university is a way of opening up the system to those who can buy the degrees so there's a lot of resistance. There's still very good quality work being done in the public university. Some of the Catholic universities are fantastic, on the other hand, while the middle schools are usually not good at all. The Catholic universities are excellent, but they're part of the public school system. They're integrated in the state school. So their faculty, their system is integrated in the public schools. But other than that, the whole attack on the public from this ideology that the private is better, is seriously endangering our what used to be a very excellent school system.
Mm-hmm. How was Bruce Springsteen concert?
Well, how does Bruce Springsteen
was it 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, I was at the concerts a couple of weeks ago. That was very strenuous because it was in the Circus Maximus in Rome, which means you stand on the slopes, and it had rained, and I'm not that young anymore. To quote a verse from Bruce Springsteen, we ain't that young anymore. So if I didn't have my two sons holding me up, I would have slid down. But anyway, he was great. The reason I became interested in Bruce Springsteen was that, one thing I didn't know growing up, is that the rock and roll that created my identity, and still does, had working class origins. The way it was marketed, from the sad day in which Elvis Presley signed for RCA, the way it was marketed was generational. And I needed a generational language anyway. But it took me some time to realize that the roots lay in country music and the blues and gospel. And the three of them are working class forms of expression, including country music, which is supposed to be very, very reactionary and often is, but it's basically the music of Southern migrants who had migrated to work in northern factories. So, this class origin, I wasn't really aware of it. And what he does is he retrieved the class origins of this music to talk about the world from which he comes, which is, his father worked at a variety of industrial jobs in the industrial town of Freehold, New Jersey. So 2 examples. Because I came to Bruce Springsteen late, and the first album I bought was The River. I hadn't bought Darkness, I got those later. But The River, number one, the title track. I come down from the valley where, mister, when you're young, they teach you to live like your father done. Wasn't this supposed to be the country of upward social mobility, where every generation was better off than the next? And he said no. So he is immediately cutting off at the roots the American dream. And on the other hand, you know that song, I don't know if you know the song, but the song is, he gets Mary pregnant, and then she marries him. That was all she wrote. They had to get married. And on his 19th birthday, two things: wedding suit and union card, which means it doesn't, you know, it just means that, you know, because you belong to a working class family, you're automatically a member of the union. It's not ideological or anything. But then what happens is, there ain't been much work on account of the economy, so he loses his job. And now Mary's pregnant. Now, it just so happens that what I think is the finest song ever written in Italy was written by a friend of mine, but before he was a friend of mine, Alessandro Portelli, who's a folk singer, topical singer from Venice, in Venetian dialect. And it's almost the same story. It says, Nina, do you remember how long it took us to finally go to bed together and make love? Because of course this is an Italian song from the mid-60s. First you marry and then you make love. In an American song from 1979, you make love and then the consequence. But incidentally, these are the two songs, the only two songs I know in which people make love and somebody gets pregnant. Because in the whole counterculture tradition, free sex, nobody gets pregnant. You know? Probably because, you know, there's such a thing as contraception, but somehow. You know, the metaphor is your actions have consequences. So, and in the end, and the song, Gualtiero Bertelli's song ends with, and now you're pregnant and I'm out of a job. And it's over. Bruce Springsteen's song continues, and he says, is a dream alive if it don't come true? Or is it a curse? Because he had a dream, you know, the American dream, and it has failed. It's a curse, it's a lie. But I go back to the river, and the river is dry. So somebody had made him a promise. He has a number of songs about promises, and then the promise was not kept. In the case of Gualtiero Bertelli, nobody made any. There's no such thing as the Italian dream. However, as all the rest of Gualtiero's songs say, he too had a dream, and the dream was communism. And that failed. And that failed. That was even worse. And he has another song, 10 years later. He goes back and talks to Nina, and Nina tells him, you know, when they take away your bread, it's bad. But when they take away your dreams, it's even worse. Now, in the case of Bruce Springsteen, he claims that we still have a right to dream. We still have a right to imagine a future. And the other song that really captivated me was the silliest song in the record, on the river, Sherry Darling. I don't know if you're familiar with Sherry Darling, but Sherry Darling is the typical girl beach car song. He's in the car, he's going to the beach with his girl. However, before he goes to the beach with his girl, he has to take her mother to the employment office. And her mother is sitting in the back and she won't shut up. So suddenly, you know, this world of country beach, girl beach car, includes an old working class woman who incidentally lives in the ghetto, because he says if she doesn't shut up, she'll take the bus back to the ghetto tonight. And this, it tells you what kind of world this music comes from. And so that was the beginning, and then there's more.
I think the last question could be asked by Shimon. Maybe so we can.
Okay, so probably it would be a question about culture, football. So about one of your passions.
I know about you. I've been told.
Okay, so I will try ask.
You should have beat up the fans, the Roma fans, not the Sevilla fans.
No, I'm fan of our local club, but the question is about your love to Lazio.
Okay.
Because I read in anthology Polish edition that you are a fan of Lazio Rome, and today we are talking a lot about politics too. So, image of Lazio fans is very far right, especially if we are talking about Curva Nord, so north, so stand of fanatics of Lazio Rome and group Irudicibili. It's almost a fascist group. So, what is the story of your love to Lazio? Because if we can choose a club, I suppose
no, you
we'll
can't.
be fan of AS Livorno from Toscana, because if we focus on political side, but football is not only.
I mean, one of the best chapters in my Terni book is about this woman, communist, working class, who spent 17 years being in love with a fascist. You don't choose your club any more than you choose a person you fall in love with. So that's number one. Number two, my father was a player in the minor teams of Lazio in the 1930s. But until the age of 5, I thought I was an Inter fan. Then my father took me to my first football game. And when your first football game, Lazio with your father, that is very important. You know, Lazio beats Juventus 2-0. You're marked for life. And yes, Lazio has a history of right-wing fans, and it still has a present. On the other hand, if you watch the game in Budapest, the Roma fans had a huge slogan, Figli della Lupa, the sons of the she-wolf. That was a fascist youth organization in the 30s. Because unfortunately, we Lazio are no longer the only fascist club in Serie A. The Terni fascists, the Terni soccer fan are radical right, radical left, except the club is being bought by this radical right tycoon, so there's a class struggle within. But anyway, because the right wing had the very intelligent vision of working within the world of football fans. They penetrated all the organizations. Roma fans did not used to be all right-wing until the left Roma fans were literally kicked out of the stadium by the right. So Roma and Lazio fans often join, the right wings often join together attacking them. So for what accounts, I'm a member of a small organization called Lazio and liberty for left-wing Lazio fans. But when I was the mayor's advisor on historical memory, there was an event in which Lazio fans clashed physically with Livorno fans. Livorno fans are exactly like our fans, except that they think they're Stalinists. Ours know that they're fascists. But there was this big thing. And I and another member of the city council, who was also a Lazio fan, decided to do something about this. So we just sent out an email message to our address list saying, will anti-fascist Lazio fans please speak up? Within 3 hours we had 600 signatures. Because the point is, on the one hand, the non-fascist Lazio fans did not have a voice. Now they're trying to create one, and incidentally, they've been attacked. The Lazio Free and Liberty fans have already been beaten up. On the other hand, the media are lazy. So you have this, when you have to think of fascism and football fandom, Lazio is automatic. But Inter, Verona, Rome as well. So the problem is, and I'm not saying to this, and this does not absolve the Lazio fascists. It just says that the disease is spreading, the other thing is, I personally. I have enough memory to remember the days before organized fans, which means that back then, see, we old people, in my days, you'd go to the stadium and you're going to see a Lazio Roma game, you might end up sitting next to a Roma fan. Occasionally you would see a fist fight, but the lesson was, your center forward falls in the penalty area, and you stand there, penalty, and the guy says, no, you didn't even touch him, and you had to listen to another voice. Today you go to the game, and if you don't say penalty, the other people say, well, are you a spy? Because there's only one opinion possible. Which means, incidentally, that in this case, Roma is the world champion. Victims, feeling like everybody's robbing us, everybody's against us. This is the main sentiment among all football fans, because they only talk to one another, they never talk to the others. So, which in turn generates violence, etc. So there's no going back to but separating the fans prevents battles, but also prevents dialogue, and I think what has been happening, the right-wing radicalization of soccer fans, is a result of an intelligent vision from the right, and this isolation in which everybody thinks that everybody else is an enemy, unfortunately.
Can I have one more question? I wanted to ask you, do you have your favorite question that you ask?
My present?
Your favorite question that you ask most of your interviewees, or maybe all of them?
That's a very good question. No, I don't think so. The reason I don't have a favorite question is I manage to say whatever I want, no matter what the questions are. So, no, I can't think of, but I will use this in my interviews. Thank you.
So, well, it's almost 2 hours we're discussing not all of your passions. Books and movies are left, but maybe, well, what do you think about discussing this on our next meeting? Perhaps in Wrocław again, or in Kraków?
Or in this festival.
Or during the festival in Abruzzi, right? Mm-hmm. Is it July
29, 30, 31. And there will be concerts, music laboratories.
You see, they are already arranging the trip. Yeah, let's hire the coach and get there by coach.
Think about it. Yeah.
And some tents and any questions from the audience? Any more questions? Sandro, as always, you gave us more than we expected. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. And thank you again for sharing your experiences and your thoughts and your opinions and all the facts we get from you, actually, because as you could see, I was really interested in Italy and Italian culture. We know Sandro's English language text. They are in many terms universal, but Italian is your background, and so it was really interesting to hear this. And thank you. And
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. And I remember, Marta, I was at the beginning in Poland when she invented oral history in this country, and I was there. So it's very exciting to be here and to be with Marta and with you all.
Yes, I remember. And if you know that Sandro's picture and Tom Hardy were published in our primer. Oral history primer. Yeah. So that was the generosity of Sandro, who spent quite a lot of time discussing with us and answering our sometimes naive questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this was fun.
Okay. So we had a proper discussion, almost 2 hours. Thank you. You want some water, maybe?
Thank you.